Welcome back. It's great to have you with us. I can't believe another week's gone by, but we are getting into the meat of Elijah. I'm really excited by this, I have to say, because whilst I appreciate the thoroughness with which Beryl's doing it, and the story of before Elijah and the preliminaries, I really want to know about Elijah. So I'm really pleased about this. So really looking forward to it, Beryl, and thank you so much for leading us through this.
So this is the next phase in Elijah's story. I called this one Elijah, the Troubler of Israel. That goes in inverted commas, but you'll see when we do the reading why that's appropriate.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And we're moving on from chapter 17, I'm pleased to say. We're now in 1 Kings 18.
Very good.
And 1 to 19, which reads, After a long time, in the 3rd year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria, and Ahab had summoned Obadiah, his palace administrator. Obadiah was a devout believer in the Lord. While Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them in 2 caves, 50 in each, and had supplied them with food and water. Ahab had said to Obadiah, Go through the land to all the springs and valleys. Maybe we can find some grass to keep the horses and the mules alive, so we will not have to kill any of our animals. So they divided the land they were to cover, Ahab going in one direction and Obadiah in another. As Obadiah was walking along, Elijah met him. Obadiah recognized him, bowed down to the ground and said, Is it really you, my lord Elijah? Yes, he replied. Go tell your master, Elijah is here. What have I done wrong, asked Obadiah, that you are handing your servant over to Ahab to be put to death? As surely as the Lord your God lives, there is not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you. And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed you were not there, he made them swear that they could not find you. But now you tell me to go to my master and say, Elijah is here. I don't know where the Spirit of the Lord may carry you when I leave you. If I go and tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he will kill me. Yet I, your servant, have worshipped the Lord since my youth. Haven't you heard, my lord, what I did while Jezebel was killing the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and supplied them with food and water. And now you tell me to go to my master and say, Elijah is here. He will kill me. Elijah said, As the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, Is that you, you troubler of Israel? I have not made trouble for Israel, Elijah replied, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So the drama.
It's building. It's building.
Building.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So we've got 3 parts to this passage.
Okay.
First one in verse 1, where the end of the drought is promised. Then 2 to 16, Elijah's encounter with Obadiah. And then 17 to 19, what happens when Elijah meets Ahab.
Okay.
So if we look at verse 1, where the end of the drought is promised. It's not explicitly stated, but Elijah most probably remained in the widow's home in Zarephath for the remainder of the drought, until the time when God told him to go and confront Ahab once again. Now, if you look back to chapter 17, verse 3, verse 1, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except by my word. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here. So that was to announce the drought. And then in 18 verse 1, the word of the Lord came to Elijah again. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. So this is the drought comes in the midst of these two chapters. Protracted period of drought. How long was it? We know.
3 years, isn't it?
Well, yes, it's usually taken to have lasted 3 years or 3.5 years.
Okay.
As it's mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, where it says 3.5, and also in James.
Yes.
Luke 4:25 and James 5 verse 17. 3 years or 3.5 years, according to those references in the New Testament. It was certainly a protracted period of drought. It was probably about 18 months in total. Part of the first year, all of the second year, part of the third year.
Okay.
And there's contemporary Phoenician history that mentions a 1-year drought during the reign of Ithabal, king of Tyre, and he was Ethbaal in the Old Testament and was the father of Jezebel.
Okay. Okay.
So this reference fixes it right in the right time.
Mm.
Now the discrepancies aren't particularly significant because they depend upon whether the start of the drought was reckoned from the last time it rained or from when the expected autumn rains failed.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
And also there were different ways of reckoning years between the North and South Kingdom, and also, of course, it was probably a shorter period of the full-scale drought in Phoenicia because it was that much further north.
Yes.
And would have started a bit later. I mean, to bring it up to date, I mean, if you think about the duration of the COVID pandemic so far, is it reckoned from when it first appeared in China? Or when that was November, December 2019? Or when the virus began to spread around the world? Or when the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic in February 2020?
Yes.
So there's always been sort of.
Yeah, and presumably the same is true of the ending, isn't it? Because, you know, if you were living in Hunan and, you know, and I mean, they would probably say that the thing ended sometime last year.
Yeah.
You know, because there were no more cases, but if that's true, but who knows?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So whereas we would reckon it as being just over a year in duration at present, I know it seems a lot longer than that.
Yeah, yeah.
But in fact, we would reckon it as being about just over a year. According to the ancient Israelite mode of reckoning, it would be 3 years already.
Okay, okay.
So it would have been part of 2018.
Yes.
2019, sorry, all of 2020 and part of 2021.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's just got to be fluid. The main thing is that this was a protracted period of drought.
And actually, if you look at 18 verse 1, it doesn't say specifically, does it? It says, after a long time, in the third year,
Yeah,
which would fit very well with what you're saying, because
yeah,
we are in the third year of, COVID, but
yeah.
it's not been 3 years long. Yeah.
No. But whereas in our culture we're used to reckoning things precisely,
Yes.
they were much more
Mm.
vague in those days.
Yeah.
But the point was, God had not forgotten his servant Elijah
Yeah.
during all this length of time, however long it was. And now, when the time was right, in accordance with God's plan, he called him to end his exile and return to Israel.
Yeah.
You have to wonder what Elijah thought about that. Was he
Yes, you can see.
relieved?
I mean, when we first read it, one of the things that really struck me was you can suddenly begin to appreciate the nature and the detail of the preparation that he went through. His time in the Kerith
Yeah,
Valley, his time, with
with
the
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 widow.
widow of Zarephath, and the way that he is learning to obey is really quite key when you get into 18 and you know what's coming, because so much of what he's about to do requires precise obedience and profound trust. It really does.
Yeah. So we
There's
still back to trust and obey. Has been the theme through all of these studies.
Yes, absolutely, and particularly when you realize that Obadiah, here's this guy who's seen as a sort of faithful servant in Ahab's court, who's absolutely terrified he's going to get killed for reporting misinformation.
You
I
you
mean,
can understand why.
well, yeah, but you think, well, if you think you're in trouble, just think of Elijah.
That's right.
So there's got to be this incredible confidence in God, isn't it? And he uses that little phrase, doesn't he? Which it becomes a bit of an Elijah favorite, doesn't it? Because it comes out in 17 verse 1. He likes saying, as the Lord God of Israel, whom I serve. He likes that whom I serve phrase, doesn't he?
Yes.
And yeah, it's quite a key phrase and key statement.
So in Israel, things were reaching a crisis
Yeah,
point when
yeah.
Elijah came on the scene again. And then the second part of this is his encounter with Obadiah. Who was he? We ask ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, is this the same Obadiah as the smallest book in the Old Testament?
No,
No. Okay, that's interesting.
absolutely nothing to do with the writer of that little book,
Okay.
as he was around in the 6th century BC, 6th or
Okay.
5th century. So it precedes that by
Yeah.
quite a while. And his name meant the servant of Yahweh,
Okay.
God. And of course, we saw with Elijah that his parents had given him his name. They were Yahweh worshippers, and it looks
Mm.
like Obadiah came from a similar group
Okay.
that were willing to give this title to their child's name, the Yah bit, to
Mm.
say
Yeah.
they were
Yeah.
worshippers of Yahweh. But he was more than that. He was also the king's principal steward.
Absolutely. Interesting position.
He was over the household, a high status position.
Mm.
And given what we know about Ahab and Jezebel's court, you can't help but wonder how he managed to hold that
Yeah.
position,
Yeah. Yeah.
the balance that he had to exert
Mm.
between his personal faith and his professional position.
Well,
Because in that, sorry, go on.
there are sort of slight overtures of Daniel about this, aren't there?
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's a real sense of his precarious position is utterly dependent on the preservation of God, really.
Yeah. Because as the king's principal steward over the household, he was responsible for the administration of the palace
Mm.
and the management of the royal estates. But interestingly, we see in verse 6 the king obviously trusted him,
Yeah. Yeah.
because it got to this crisis, which I'll talk about in a minute, but they divided the land between them, and the king went one way and Obadiah went the other.
Mm.
Ahab wasn't able, obviously, to cover the whole land in the time at his disposal.
Yeah.
So he trusted Obadiah to go and do the business. In other words, we might say Obadiah had the king's ear.
Yeah.
And the royal household would have been quite extensive as far as officials and so on were concerned, servants. The three main ones were the principal steward, the secretary of state, and the royal herald. There are some similarities.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
Sometimes. But although he was a prominent official in the royal household, Obadiah was also a faithful worshipper of God,
Mm.
and had managed to hide 100 prophets in caves, probably in the Mount Carmel region. On the map, you don't need to look at it now, but on the map, it's the little bit that juts out as you're following the coast south from Sidon and Zarephath, and then you come to a little bump, which is back in Israelite territory, and that was Mount Carmel poking out into the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
And there were many caves there. And it's interesting, despite the drought, he managed to feed and water these prophets that he hid.
Yeah.
The other thing that strikes me as being quite amazing, that he hid 50 prophets in each cave. Now, it must have been a very big cave.
Yeah. Yeah. They're not small caves, are they?
And 50 people, however quiet they're keeping,
Yeah.
are bound to make a noise.
Mm.
So there is some schools of thought that think that it wasn't 50 people in two caves, but 100 prophets spread amongst several caves.
Okay.
But they use this, the Old Testament uses this idea of 50 just as this was a large number.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, because that comes back to us later, doesn't it? You know, when Elijah's going, you know, I'm the only one left, and
Yeah.
you know, and then God refers to those he's been able to reserve. So yeah, and it is that thing about you're not the only one. There's a large number of you.
Yeah. But I mean, to have 50 people traipsing about even in a large cave would have created quite a noise. And
oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, however quiet they were, just simply moving about would have created noise.
Yeah.
So that's what Obadiah had been doing.
Yes, and actually supplying 100 people with food. You're not taking your sandwich box, are you? I mean, even the very fact of moving the logistics of the thing. I mean, one, it says something quite significant about Obadiah's logistical ability, but being able to move that sort of stuff without anybody noticing, I mean, that's pretty remarkable, really.
Yes. I mean, okay, he was the principal steward and had responsibility for managing the royal estates. So to some extent, people wouldn't have necessarily questioned him taking a large amount of food or water, but there was a famine going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Which is really part of the next question, which is what had been happening in the kingdom of Israel during the time of the drought. Well, as the drought, there was famine. It says in verse 2, the famine was severe in Samaria.
And then there's dear old Jezebel.
Yeah.
Where it says quite glibly, I have to say, it's sort of almost like a sort of throwaway line, really. While Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, you're thinking, Surely you could have made a bit more of it than that. This is not sort of, she killed 2 flies that were irritating her, and she probably had that sort of attitude. But this is quite something, isn't it?
Killing off the Lord's prophets.
Yeah.
So she'd instigated this widespread persecution, really, of the national religion, and killed the prophets of the Lord. Presumably, partly because she couldn't find Elijah, whom she blamed for the drought. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and why did Ahab use Obadiah to find the grass? Well, because his wife was too busy killing people. Oh dear.
Yeah, I mean, there must have been some interesting conversations between Jezebel and Ahab about the drought and why it had happened, who was responsible for it. And they had no doubt that Elijah was at the root of this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he'd
ignoring
admitted
the fact,
so, hadn't he? He'd
yeah,
fessed up right at the beginning. It's my fault.
And Ahab had searched high and low for Elijah, not only throughout the kingdom, but the neighboring lands and realms. And in accordance with the laws of extradition, he'd taken solemn oaths from the rulers that they were not harboring Elijah. It's interesting that all this time Elijah was able to stay in Sidon, the kingdom of Sidon. And it may be that it never occurred to Ahab that Elijah would have taken refuge in Jezebel's homeland.
Well, yeah, there's a certain irony there, isn't there?
And why was he looking for him? Why did he want to see Elijah?
I mean, presumably he wants him to turn the tap back on.
Right. Was it to kill him?
That doesn't make any sense at all, does it? I mean, particularly because there is an interesting relationship between Ahab and Elijah, isn't there? Because whilst Jezebel obviously has steam coming out of her ears, Ahab seems to still have some sort of respect for, and the recognition of, I guess, the recognition of the anointing that is upon upon Elijah. That this is not some charlatan or fraud. This is genuinely the Lord's prophet.
Yes. So I think primarily it was to seek news of when the drought was going to end.
Yeah.
And then as the famine got worse, Ahab and Obadiah traveled throughout the kingdom looking for water or streams that had not quite dried up, in order to find grass and fodder for the horses and mules. We see in verse 5.
Yeah.
Maybe we can find some grass to keep the horses and mules alive, so we will not have to kill any of our animals. Why was this a priority?
I'm assuming horses and mules were about wealth and status, weren't they?
Yeah.
No.
Now it has been. Go on.
I can't come up with another answer, so
that's all right. Well, it's been suggested, which you were hinting at in a way there, that this was an example of Ahab's wickedness.
Okay.
Selfishly seeking supplies for the royal household.
Yes, while his people are starving. Yeah.
Yeah, in order to maintain their luxurious lifestyle and their status.
Yeah.
But, it's a big but, there was an ever-present threat of invasion from the Aramaeans, Syrians as we would call them, at this time, and it was essential that Ahab kept his troops ready for action.
So a mobile army is critical.
Yeah. And we know his army was extensive because according to an Assyrian source, it's on on a tablet, it's on a column
Mm.
that's inscribed, that's actually in the British Museum.
Yep.
But we read this. Let me find the right bit now. It's the Assyrian king describing this conflict that he was about to engage in. Said, I captured the town of Agana, that's in Syria, took out fine booty. I set fire to the palaces. I departed from there and drew near to Karkar, then demolished, destroyed, and burned down Karkar, his royal residence. But he was saying in the preamble to all of this report, the ruler of northern Syria called upon 12 local kings to come and support him from these little petty kingdoms all around.
Okay.
And that he lists how much they provided him with, or how much he had to contend against. There were 1,200 chariots, 1,200 cavalry horses, 20,000 men belonging to Hadadezer of Damascus. He was the head of this 12 country coalition. 700 chariots, 700 cavalry, 10,000 men of Iruleni the Hamathite, and then the third one on the list, because they're listed in order of importance, 2,000 chariots and 10,000 men of Ahab the Israelite.
Okay. Okay. Very interesting.
So he's actually mentioned and his army in this Assyrian
Yes.
record. And it goes on down the other members of the coalition, how much they contributed. So Ahab was no mean player in this.
Okay. Okay.
He was the third importance, and his, what he could contribute was quite significant.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if we say that, according to that, Ahab's army consisted of 10,000 foot soldiers, his chariot corps was 2,000 strong. Some think it was 200, but it does seem as if it was 2,000. With a chariot, you had to have 3 horses, at least 3 horses. There were 2 pulling it and 1 spare in case one got lame or whatever. So if you take three horses per chariot and you've got 2,000 in your corps, the provision of fodder for that amount.
Oh yeah, it becomes quite critical, doesn't it? It really does. Well, particularly, I mean, they also mention the mules, don't they? So because,
That's right.
a marching army of that size requires an awful lot of support.
Absolutely. The number of mules, I mean, doesn't list how many, but a vast number needed for the logistics of supplying the army during military action. And once you factor that in, the amount of fodder required is increased exponentially.
Yeah.
So it's reckoned that each horse or mule required about 4 pounds of fodder per day.
Okay. Okay.
I leave you to do the math, as the Americans would say.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
But we're talking vast quantities here. We're not talking about a couple of bags of oats from the garden centre. It's huge.
Yeah.
And consequently, the rapidly diminishing supply of fodder as a result of drought was a massive problem for Ahab.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't just, his status and to continue with his luxurious lifestyle. There was a much more pragmatic reason for this.
Yeah.
And the thing there's not much to admire about Ahab in general, but in this, I do find a sneaking respect for him because he was hands-on.
Yes. Yes.
He sent Obadiah one way and he went the other way to look for this.
Yeah.
He wasn't just sort of sat on his throne back in Samaria saying, don't be ridiculous, go and get me some fodder.
No.
We're going to go and search everywhere.
Yeah.
Go go through the land to all the springs and valleys. Maybe we can find some grass to keep the horses and mules alive.
Mm.
So they'd split up in this search. And it was while Obadiah was on this search, he encountered Elijah. I mean, verse 7 is I find it quite amusing. There's this crisis, there's a drought, they're running out of fodder rapidly, they don't know when they're going to be invaded. As Obadiah was walking along,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But it also has a sort of there's a sense in which it feels a little bit like the 17 verse 7, where it says, sometime later the book dried up, and then the word of the Lord said, go at once to Zarephath in Sidon and stay there. I've commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. And it's this sort of, it's quite interesting because there's two examples here. I mean, what are the chances of actually Elijah bumping into Obadiah? There's a sense in which there's the guidance of God about this, isn't there? There's sort of, this is a divine encounter, divine appointment on both scores. And I find that really quite interesting, that because often we can think about coincidence, and that these, I remember somebody saying, I don't understand how prayer works, but what I understand is when we pray, coincidences happen. And there's a sense in which you get that feeling here, don't you? That it's no coincidence that Obadiah and Elijah meet. It was by the deliberately design of God. Because if Elijah had sort of come cold into Ahab's presence, goodness only knows what would have happened. But here's a go-between that in one sense holds Elijah in high regard, but is also held in high regard by Ahab, and therefore can act as some sort of mediator in the situation, even though he's a bit reluctant, understandably.
Very reluctant,
Yeah.
But I just like that phrase, as Obadiah was walking along.
Yes, I know. Yes, master of the art of the the ridiculous, really.
Yeah.
But it is a bit like verse 4 as well. While Jezebel was killing off, Obadiah was walking along.
I'm reminded of a story Rex Mason once told us. Not long after he left Albany Road and he went to Spurgeon's. So I know everybody thinks he was Old Testament scholar in Regents, which he was. But when he first left Albany Road, he went to Spurgeon's to lecture in New Testament.
Oh, okay.
And he said, they had in their intake of students that somebody who'd been a policeman for a number of years, risen to the rank of sergeant and so on. He said his first essays were sort of like a police report.
Oh yeah, I can imagine. Yes, I can imagine.
As Paul was proceeding along the Damascus Road.
Yes. In fact, I had the same. It was interesting when I joined Care for the Family, and one of the things I had to do was write articles for all sorts of different periodicals and things. And the first one I wrote, it got sent back to me about 4 times. Richard, you are not at university now. This is not some sort of, people have got to be able to read this.
Yeah.
So when I got to Albany Road, and Lorna said to me, "Will you write the pastor's letter?" And I said to her, "How many words do you want?" She burst into laughter. No minister's ever asked me that before.
Yeah. So there we are.
Yeah.
As Obadiah was proceeding around the countryside.
Absolutely. But it does make it personable, doesn't it, Beryl? It does make it.
Oh, yeah.
It's not like, I've seen that, that column and I've looked at the translation that sort of sits there alongside it. And it doesn't read like the Old Testament. It doesn't read like this. It reads in a sort of quite official, matter-of-fact sort of way. Whereas this has these little endearing things like he was walking along.
Yes. And it makes him so real.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Now, how did he react to Elijah's unexpected appearance?
He was somewhat shocked. In fact, again, even that is quite personable, isn't it? Obadiah recognized him, and there's this sort of, there's that really human thing where it is. Oh, is
I'm
it?
sure.
And you get that sort of, and there's a sense of
Yeah,
which that's going on, isn't it? And he bows down to the ground, but it's still quite uncertain.
yeah. Yes, he bowed down to the ground. He showed him respect, but he was still this. Is it really you?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, we've scoured the countryside, we've looked everywhere, and lo and behold, you appear.
Hey, you pop up.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But not only that, he was then shocked when Elijah told him to report his reappearance to Ahab.
Mm, mm.
He was afraid Elijah would disappear again before Ahab arrived, which is a very natural reaction,
Yeah. But there must have been
considering
a
they haven't
sense.
been able to find him.
No, and there must have been a sense, mustn't there? Because when he says in verse 12, I don't know where the Spirit of the Lord may carry you, there must have been a sense at the beginning of verse 17, that his disappearance was quite mysterious. There's
Yes.
one minute he was there, and the next minute he'd gone. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that he was sort of beamed up and dropped in the Kerith Valley,
No, but I mean, there is that sort of mystical element
there
about
is,
Elijah's
yes,
story
yes,
anyway.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And presumably, I mean, if he vanishes without trace for 12 months, 18 months, 3 years, that in and of itself must have left a sort of mystique about the whole situation. Where the heck has Elijah gone?
He must
Um,
have died, be
well, yeah, yeah, potentially, or
the natural conclusion.
yeah, yes, I suppose so. Yeah.
Researched high and low, you can find him anywhere. All
Hmm.
the neighbouring kingdoms have sworn that he wasn't there.
Which
So
must
what
have
had
must
happened?
have created some anxiety as well, because his very last words were, "In the next few years, except at my word." If
Yes,
Elijah's died, how long is this drought going to last?
no,
It's
yeah,
it leaves some uncertainty, doesn't it? And yet the irony of it all is that all Ahab really had to do was to repent.
yes,
But the one thing he will not do and does not do is precisely the solution. And isn't that so true of humanity? We can know, it always strikes me about people who've been brought up in church, and then they it's not that they don't know, it's that they won't do.
yes, that's right. But whatever, this wasn't a very welcome commission that Elijah was giving in
No.
Obadiah.
I'm not sure
Yeah.
Elijah's was too welcome either, that God had given
Well,
him.
no, actually.
Yeah,
But it's worth
absolutely.
thinking about how we respond to an unwelcome
Yes.
commission.
Yeah. Or even how we respond, because this is the other thing I find really interesting. I mean, just in this past few weeks, you know um the thumb thing was one of the things that was most interesting about Val's thumb, and it was all interesting, was the fact that she was very reluctant to go, I've got a thumb problem, because
Yeah,
in the minute, I mean, it was true of talking to Ivion as well. We mentioned in another service somebody with a problem in their back, and he's sitting there and he knows full well he's got a problem in his back, but because the pain was deferred into his leg, he rationalized it away.
yeah,
And how easily we sort of go sort of like that and let
yeah.
it go past us. It's very interesting, isn't it, how we are as human beings in those situations. Because here's
Mm,
Obadiah, and he's been incredibly faithful and in a very precarious situation. And yet now, what seems in one sense a relatively minor thing in comparison to hiding 100 prophets, because that would have got him killed. I mean, there's no doubt about
well,
that.
absolutely.
Or even if he'd done none of that, but been discovered to continue to be faithful, Jezebel would
Yeah,
have got him, wouldn't she? And yet, when it comes to something that seems relatively minor, his worry is not about Ahab. His worry is about Elijah, isn't it? I know what you're going to do. The minute I turn my back, you're out of here, aren't you?
that's right.
And I'm gonna have egg on my face. I'm
I'm
gonna
going to
look
pop
really
it.
stupid.
Yeah. Yes, if I go and tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he will kill me.
Yeah, yeah.
Yet I, your servant, have worshipped the Lord since my youth.
Mm, yeah.
You wonder, I mean, we've got no way of knowing this. But that's always the problem when we're studying passages from the Bible. There's always bits you want to know that aren't there.
Yeah, always. Always.
But but it does beg the question as to why Ahab appointed him, because
Yeah,
he'd
yeah, yeah.
been a worshipper of Yahweh since his youth. That must have been known.
Yes.
So it tells us something about Obadiah's character.
Yes, yeah. And it also tells us something about Ahab, doesn't it? I mean, Ahab is in a precarious place here, isn't he? Without a shadow of a doubt, because he can only maintain his position as king whilst the people are prepared to, I mean, it's always the case, isn't it? So
Yeah,
there is this sort of balancing act whilst wanting to do precisely what he wants to do. And you could sort of understand why he might have, token representatives within his court, because those who would question Ahab would go, well, okay, hang on a minute, at least there's an Obadiah, and it's an interesting political. The feeling you get throughout the whole story is that Ahab is a political player, really.
when he is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because he doesn't marry Jezebel out of love. You
Oh
never
no,
get
that was
that
an arranged
impression.
marriage.
Yeah, yeah, it was it was politically expedient, wasn't it?
Yes, to make the alliance between Israel and Tyre.
I mean, it's only when Jezebel arrives that he finds something of a kindred spirit.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
She brought that out of him.
Mm.
It's interesting to ponder why Elijah went to Obadiah first
Mm.
before approaching Ahab, because
Yeah.
the commission he'd had at the beginning, back in verse 1,
Mm.
the word of the Lord came to Elijah, go and present yourself to Ahab.
Yes. And whether he went to Obadiah or whether he perchance happened upon as he was en route.
They were both walking along.
Well, yes, yes, absolutely. Yes, and there's no indication that Elijah, it doesn't say Elijah recognized Obadiah. It was Obadiah that seemed to stop him. So,
Yeah, but this discourse that they had was
mm.
crucial, really,
Oh
because
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think Elijah would have found it expedient to find out Ahab's likely attitude towards him.
Mm. Mm.
He probably had a very good idea of what it would be, but wanted to hear it.
Yeah.
And it also provided reassurance for Obadiah.
Yes. 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 Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely.
Now, if you look at all of Obadiah's actions in verses 1 to 16, 2 to 16, would you characterize him as courageous or cowardly?
Oh, I mean, he has my respect without a doubt, because it's in many respects more so than Elijah. I mean, Elijah's managed to escape and hide, whereas Obadiah is having to hide in plain sight, isn't he? I mean,
Yes,
what this man has accomplished and what he then goes on to do, even though he goes, oh, you're going to disappear and I'm going to be in trouble, he still does it. He still
yeah,
goes ahead and does what he's supposed to do, and he isn't really given a lot of credit for it. I mean, verse 16 doesn't go, Obadiah had this great conversation with Ahab and managed to persuade Ahab that
persuade
this was
him.
true,
No,
etc. You just get this. It's another one of those sort of verse 4 and verse 7 things. So Obadiah went to Ahab and Ahab went to Elijah. Oh, there you go.
yeah,
He's sort of passing the baton. And that's what
That's
you get
right.
told, and you think, oh, yeah, that's a bit of a shame, really. I'd want Obadiah to seem a little more heroic, because I think he strikes me as a man that is worthy of respect.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as you say, that beginning of verse 18, Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah.
Yeah.
Contrast, isn't there, between that and Elijah's previous encounter with Ahab when he had gone to him?
Yes.
But now Ahab was coming to Elijah.
Yeah.
And of course, Elijah had to fall back on. He had his experience of God during the drought,
Mm.
his faithful care, his gracious provision, which enabled him to wait calmly for Ahab to come to him
Yeah.
with the full assurance and quiet confidence in God that he wouldn't be failed now.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely.
We don't know how long he had to wait for Ahab to show up. Obadiah and Ahab had to meet up first. And it's interesting, Elijah was quite willing to stay put wherever this meeting was.
Yes.
It wasn't a case of Obadiah saying to him, well, come along and come with me now while we go and meet him.
Yeah. Yeah, there's that, it's interesting when you meet people who have that quiet confidence in God, that
Yeah,
they exude an authority born out of that confidence, don't they? That makes you, that is reassuring, and you get that feeling, here, and it comes out in the Easter story. Jesus in front of, Pilate and Herod, etc. There's this confidence that means he doesn't have to say anything. He doesn't feel the need to run off at the mouth because of anxiety. There is this calmness, and it was the thing that struck me last Easter. This thing about nobody took Jesus' life from him; he gave it.
gave it.
And
Yeah,
John comes out with that again, doesn't he? He gave up his spirit. He lays down his life. And it is really interesting. And you get that feeling in Elijah here, that and it's going to really pay off in the next session when we
yeah,
look at Elijah on
context.
Mount
Yeah.
Carmel. His utter confidence in God, his utter sense of self-assurance as a consequence, is quite powerful and profound. And
Yeah,
you see it again, Daniel in the lion's den. I mean,
very much like Daniel.
incredible, or Paul in prison singing hymns of praise. And there is this commonality of calmness in the face
Yeah,
of great adversity. Or Polycarp, I mean,
yeah,
I will basically talking about allowing the lions to grind his bones to flour. And, you're thinking, this isn't a guy who's afraid. Amazing.
that's right. The other thing I think is interesting that this brings out about Obadiah, Ahab believed him.
Mm. Yeah.
He
Yes.
told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. No questions. No doubts. Yeah.
No, it wasn't a case of, oh, don't be ridiculous. We've hunted high and low for him.
Yeah. Yeah.
You must be mistaken. No, okay, I'll go and see him.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
how did Ahab approach this encounter?
In typically Adam and Eve style, the woman who you gave me, it's her fault. I mean, it's so classic, isn't it? It's such a classic scenario. He doesn't go, "You got me banged to rights. This is entirely my fault." He just immediately shirks the responsibility. You troubler of Israel.
Oh,
And
yeah,
and it then behooves Elijah to point out who the troubler actually is,
that's right.
who caused
Well,
all
of
of
course,
this.
Ahab knew that Elijah's previous pronouncement, I mean, the last time they'd had conversation, Elijah had announced the drought, and Ahab knew that that had happened and was still in progress. And he also knew that the gods that he and Jezebel worshipped, the Baals, were supposed by their devotees to control the rain.
Yes.
That they'd been impotent in averting the calamity and had not given the badly needed rain.
And that's really important, isn't it, Beryl? It's really important in terms of this story, because and it comes out again in terms of Moses, doesn't it? You know, and the plagues of Egypt.
Yeah.
That because people don't often realize that each of the plagues is a direct challenge to a Egyptian god. And there's that sense here, you know, it's not the reason why it's the rain that stops is because of Baal as the fertility rain god, and God going, you know, and it comes to its fruition in its head at Mount Carmel, without a doubt. But there's this incredible sort of conflict in the heavenly realms, this challenging of who God actually is, that he is the, you know, as Elijah likes calling him, he calls him, you know, the Lord God of Israel. You know, the Lord Almighty, he says, doesn't he, in verse 15, as the Lord Almighty lives. That's the point, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, compared to Baal, we're talking about the living God here. And that's what's going on here, isn't it? That is really quite critical.
And of course, during the time of the drought, I mean, Ahab had ample opportunity to be convinced that Yahweh was the sovereign ruler of heaven and earth. But instead of acknowledging this, he called Elijah, "You troubler of Israel."
Yes, yes.
And the word in Hebrew that is translated there as troubler can also mean polluter.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yes, and you can see that, can't you? You can see, you know, the inclusion of impurity. I mean, Jezebel herself, you know, immediately there's an impurity about this, regardless of what she's like. The fact that she is not of Israel, you know, and is introduced in, you know, that's exactly the same thing. Yeah.
And so in Ahab's eyes, Elijah was the one who stood out above all others against the desire to unite Israel in the worship of Baal. And therefore, in his view, he was the one that was responsible for all the distress and suffering that had filled the land. But then when we look at Elijah's response to Ahab's accusation, it's brilliant, this. And first of all, he wasn't afraid of Ahab.
No, not at all. Not at all.
So, as you were saying, it's the quiet confidence. He knew that God would not fail him.
Yeah.
And he wasn't intimidated by the king's accusation.
No.
Which he denied and turned it back upon Ahab. And then supplied the proof that it was the evil doings of Ahab and his house that were the true cause of the ills that had befallen them.
Yes. There is also a feeling of there's a journey into Ahab's demise here, isn't there? You know, and it again, it feels a bit like Pharaoh in Egypt. It's sort of, you know, it's that thing about you harden your heart, you harden your heart, you harden your heart, and then God gives you over to a hard heart. And you get that feeling of that process going on. You know, here's Ahab again with an opportunity to go with conscience, and he once again cauterizes his own conscience, you know, and ignores, and he undoubtedly he ignores what Elijah is accusing him of here.
Yeah. And that really was the catalyst for Elijah, because he recognized that the time had arrived when the religious question of the worship of Yahweh or Baal had to be settled. And it had to be settled openly and publicly.
Yes.
Before impartial witnesses.
Yes, up until this point, it's been a sort of war of attrition, hasn't it? But now it's
Yeah,
going to become out and out conflict.
yes,
It really is. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So he ordered the king to summon the people to gather at Mount Carmel. I just find that interesting. It's the people that he summons first.
Yes. Yeah, oh, yes,
Summon the
yes,
people from all over Israel,
yes. Yeah, get the witnesses there.
and then
Mm,
bring the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah,
yeah.
who eat at Jezebel's table,
Mm,
who were sponsored by her,
yeah.
people that had been installed in all the local sanctuaries.
Yeah.
So he was called to act boldly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It sort of reminds me a bit of Athanasius, and that incredible phrase, all the world's against you, Athanasius, then it's Athanasius against the world. And you get that, well, and certainly that's how Elijah, it appears, sees the situation, as we'll discover. But I mean, it says something about his courage, doesn't it? Call for the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets. It's him against the 850 and Jezebel and Ahab, and it's not. This is not evenly matched on the surface.
No. And it has a modern resonance, doesn't it?
It really does. Yes, it really does. Yeah.
The
Yes,
problems in
absolutely.
our nation and culture today,
Mm.
and the false gods in our society that
Oh yeah.
receive
Yeah.
abundant attention.
And the decline of the church in the West, and in
That's
the
right.
UK, there's something quite, well, there's something that will become quite apparently consoling, that what can seem like an absolutely dire situation, God can turn around on a dime. I mean, it can turn around very quickly. Yeah, absolutely. The trouble is, I don't want to finish at verse 19 now. I want to go on. I want to go on to verse 20.
It's like all good serials. You leave people wanting more.
You're leaving me hanging, Beryl. You're leaving me hanging. Fantastic.
Like
That's great. That's really
like
good.
the old films where the heroine was tied to the railway
Yeah,
line
that's right.
and
Yes.
he had that to be continued.
Yeah, duh, duh, duh.